Do we have to drink that?
And I know all of you are laughing and wondering why we're even in this video.
Why you're even cheating?
We get our livers.
But we thought it would be a good idea to do this. Mom, am I right smack dab in front of your face?
Nope, you aren't.
To do this. Well, Mom and Dad, neither one of them has Alzheimer's. At least we think that's the case.
We wanted to catch him before it got him. So.
Right.
And although I'm thinking I may have it, in any event, for posterity's sake, to capture Mom and Dad in their true light, the wonderful people that they are, and just the spontaneity of having them on video. And what we want to do is just keep this very informal and very casual, and hopefully we'll capture some precious moments here. As you can see, Mom is forcing this carrot juice down my throat, and this is one of those precious moments that I'm referring to. Kelly already gulped his down the second he walked in the door.
Well.
So without any further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. We want to be a little perhaps untraditional rather than jump right into a chronology of events. We thought that we'd ask them some very special and specific things, some of the highlights and high points of their life, as well as some of the low points of their life, because I think there are things, Kelly, Mom and Dad, that certainly are learned, even more learned and more memorable through our mistakes. The lessons are taught and learned. So I've asked Mom and Dad, number one, to share their favorite thought or thoughts with us, and then their favorite scriptures. And then I'd like to just go into most memorable experience, and then a time of great anxiety or distress in their life, and how they overcame it. And then Kelly's going to launch into some questions from there.
Okay.
Okay?
So our setting today,
Hey, I'm going to drink this on video.
Is a very warm, about 98 degrees, very warm July evening here at their home in their little patio. Mom and Dad are outdoor people, so we wanted to catch them first of all outdoors.
Oh, I got the pulp.
Bottoms up, Cal.
I think I can make it.
If I can do it, you can do it. I drink that whole glass down without stopping, and I hold my nose.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have to hold
I wish
my
I could
nose.
get that face on video.
No, it's all right.
That's worth 1,000 words.
If you hear someone gagging over here, you'll know why.
$10,000, the world's funniest videos. Okay, Mom, why don't we go ahead and start with you. One of those thoughts.
My favorite saying?
Yeah.
I thought that this is a story that I like to tell in giving my lesson in Relief Society about Daddy. One time when we lived on Wish Avenue, we were taking an afternoon walk, and we were going down the sidewalk. About 5 houses down from us was a gentleman that always was complaining about the ball that fell in his yard and broke when you boys were out playing in the street, and it had broken one of his roses off, or a limb off of his tree, and he disliked the ball landing in his yard. Well, anyway, he was coming toward us on the sidewalk. So when we got to him, I just walked past and didn't say anything, and Daddy said, "How are you, John? Good afternoon." John said, "Hmm." And when we got past John, I said, "Honey, why do you bother to speak with him? You know he's not going to be friendly." And Daddy said, "Why should I let John decide how I'm going to act?" And I have repeated that statement so many times. You know, we spend our lives reacting instead of acting. That's one of my favorite thoughts.
Super. Anything else, Mom?
Well, you know, if you're talking about one of my favorite poems, you reminded me of it a few minutes ago by Robert Frost, and that is, and I had to go get my nice little poetry book, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both." And it goes on to say, somewhere ages and ages hence I shall be telling this with a sigh. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
Did you take the road less traveled?
I took the road less traveled by, and I think it's made a difference in my life. It's a long story about the difference, but anyway, that's one of my favorite clocks.
Thanks. Dad?
Well, I think Mother's made the difference in my life. I probably could go to some poetry, but I'm unable to bring it to
Appreciate it.
surface right now. If I think of something, I'll let you know. But when I met your mother, my sweet wife, it was in the service, as you know already, and I found the girl that I wanted to live with.
Wasn't she a mail order
Not
bride?
only for time, but for eternity.
Wasn't she a mail order bride?
No, not quite a mail order
Didn't
bride.
you propose by mail?
He proposed by mail, but we had been together a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He still had to kneel down, didn't he?
Anyway, Dad,
The success in life we've had of just being lucky to have such beautiful children born to us, and the great love they brought into our lives. We feel like, I guess most parents feel, that they have the most beautiful, the most capable, and able children.
Well, we do.
We're certain that we do. And grandchildren. What a blessing to the grandchildren that our children brought into our lives.
Dad,
You're going to ask me for a favorite
thought.
thought.
Yeah, you were working that direction.
Man is that he might have joy.
You
How
got out
about
of that
that?
easy. Okay. All right. Now I'd like you to really just speak to the family in terms of what you would like to leave with us, what you could tell us about our future. Can you, in short, just give us something that...
Mother, we'll turn this over to you to start too.
You want me to counsel you?
Your
Well,
posterity.
not me personally, generally.
Counsel,
If you-
let's see.
Your great-great-grandchildren.
Well, as Dad
There's
said,
not enough
Dad
room
had a-
on this tape for all the counseling that I need.
Dad- I always say that I'm going to continue to counsel each one of you, Dad and I, until even though you're gotten grown and you're very successful in your own lives, I feel that we'll counsel you on occasion. But Dad, I thought Dad said a good thing. Man is that he might have joy. I think you ought to be happy. Find happiness in everything. Look on the positive side. Have faith. That beautiful article that was in the April Ensign 1992 that said, I've forgotten the name of it, but the main thought was, we believe in Christ, but do we believe Christ? Do we have faith? Do we take our problems to Him and leave them there, or are we continually frightened and nervous and, just all the time worrying about what's going to happen in the future? Or, Dad and I have had a lot of hard times in our lives. We've been through probably more hard times than any one of you have ever been through, even though you think it's hard at the time. You haven't been through a fraction of the really hard times, and we didn't have any family to go to. We didn't have anybody to help us, but we've learned and during those hard times, to get down on our knees, turn it over to Father in heaven, and leave it there, and know that He's going to help us if we do our part. He's going to come through.
Super.
What else would you like to know?
Well, your words of wisdom, Dad.
Word of wisdom?
This is your moment to impart with posterity.
Well, my word of wisdom is to look for a girl and be very careful how you look so that you get the right one. I was fortunate enough to get the right one. Camille and I have had the pleasure over the years of having all you beautiful children, and now the beautiful grandchildren that you're bringing into our lives. We feel that's a special blessing. And we just tell our Heavenly Father every night when we go to bed how thankful we are for all.
And that they chose very carefully, each one of you.
That you were careful in choosing your mates. That's also been a great blessing to us as your parents. And now as grandparents, we are truly happy for all the grandchildren you're bringing into our lives.
Well, all 5 of your children have been married in the temple. All 4 of your boys have been on missions. How did you do it?
You all have a good education.
We all have a good education.
We've stressed
college
education. We've stressed missions.
Well,
we've stressed
how did you do that?
marrying in the temple. Just stressing it in the home and talking about it constantly and having pictures on the wall and pictures in front of you and putting up little sayings, trying to do it very without you realizing we were doing it.
Sir Kelly, you remember how fun those family home evenings were.
Yeah.
We look forward to those every week.
How many nods you got in the head those back already?
How many times did we fall asleep?
How many
But
times
they were worth it.
we fought through those family home evenings, I tell you.
Family prayer.
You'd shake your head and think, is it worth it? And the many times we'd go to church and fight with you children and think, what am I doing here? I'd be better off at home running around the house. But you see, it does pay off. You just keep working at it.
Were Kim and Kenny and Pam in attendance to these family home evenings?
Yes, they were.
I don't recollect. I remember.
Well, they were
me and you being there.
They were older.
They were always older.
And they may have been out at family home evenings.
What about family get-togethers? We always had a lot of. What are some of the remembrances you have of some of our way back times at Yosemite or other Carpinteria?
Kelly, that's great. Before we're going to get deep into this video here, before we do that, I want to get into the scripture and get that out of the way, because once we get into that, we're into it.
While Daddy's finding his scripture, I want to tell you that so many nights we thank Heavenly Father. We look and think about each one of you and the person that you have chosen as your mate, and we think, who else, would have been so perfect for each one of you? I mean, just think about it. It's hard for you to look at yourself, but think about Kenny and Elise and Kim and Jane and Pam and Dave and Tina and and Chris and Melanie. Didn't you choose perfect mates, every one of you?
I think so.
Dad and I often sit and think
Yeah.
how special
And
that
perfect
is.
grandchildren, those mates.
Yes.
Well,
We're
just
so blessed for that.
pass on the same message to our children. Well, Dad, scripture.
Well, I'm selecting one of my scriptures, and I like it. I have more, but let's go with this one. It's found in St. Luke chapter 17, beginning with verse 6. And the Lord said, if ye had faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye might say unto this sycamine tree, be thou plucked up by the root, and be thou planted in the sea, and it should obey you. But which of you, having a servant plowing or feeding cattle, will say unto him, by and by, when he is come from the field, go and sit down to meat? And will not rather say unto him, make ready wherewith I may sup, and gird thyself, and serve me, till I have eaten and drunken, and afterward thou shalt eat and drink? Question mark. Doth he thank that servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I trow not. So likewise ye, when ye shall have done all those things which are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. That concludes that part of what I would, how I would express as a biblical verse that I like to refer to.
Why, Dad? Why that particular analogy?
Well, it's thinking of others, actually, more than you think of yourself, is actually what it brings out in my mind, whether you're dealing with friends or family, and how you can accommodate them as you were the father or just a good friend. And I gather that from those verses. I have others, but I can't readily pick them out for you right now. But Mother expressed one for her.
I too have so many favorite scriptures, and I would need to have a little more time, you know, to go through. But there's one that I often repeat to myself, and that is, "For God so loved the world." To me, it's the scriptures all in a nutshell. All the scriptures in a nutshell can be tied up in one verse. "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoso believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life." Now, I have such a love for the Savior. I oftentimes will lie in bed and visualize, if I'm awake and, you know, trying to get to sleep at night, I'll try to visualize myself walking across the pastures where I used to live when I was a little girl in the South, walking across the pastures with the Savior, hand in hand, and visualizing what it would be like if we truly love the Savior and believe him and try to follow him. That's what life is all about. So that's my favorite scripture. But I have a lot of them.
Mother has more too, like we both do, but we won't use most of your film up on those. What else would you like to ask us?
On the front end, and Kelly, then we'll get into what you asked, but I think there's so much to be said about tenacity, sticking to whatever it is you're doing in spite of the problems. And so for that reason, I think it would be helpful in the front end, before we get into a lot of the memories that indeed will take up more time. But one of the most painful, distressing moments, and again, I think it's important to put this on, because I think everybody needs to know that it's not a bed of roses, and then, you know, basically how we got through it, or how you got through it, ultimately then how we got through it. But a time of distress or high anxiety, and please don't hold any punches. The whole idea here is to just be candid. Whatever comes to the top of your mind as being a time that was truly heart-wrenching.
Well, I have one that occurs to me with regard to that, and I'm sure Mother does too. Whether she's out of it now or not, I don't know, but let me bring it up. When we met, of course, we evidently fell in love with each other, because I met her at, what was the fort I met you at?
Fort Knox.
Fort Knox. I was only there temporarily. I had to return to Fort Benning. No, it was not Fort Benning.
Fort Bragg.
What was that?
Fort Bragg.
Fort Bragg, that's it, Cal. I returned to Fort Bragg, and actually, deciding that we were going to get married took place, and Camille was satisfied enough to have found me, and I certainly was to have found her, and so she hopped a train to Fort Bragg, where we were married by the chaplain there at Fort Bragg. It was
in the chapel there.
In the chapel.
And the reason that I hopped the train and went there is because he had chosen to be married in that chapel, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and that's where he wanted to be married. So I went there.
It was a marriage we both remember. Three of my best friends, all officers, stood around and witnessed the marriage. And then we took our honeymoon on up the coast into New York City, and it was a lovely time together. Of course, I was allowed to leave the Army. They call it mustering out, I guess, is the term. It was the end of the war as far as we were concerned, and we were to go home. So Camille and I made the trip to what we had to call home. It seemed the only place for both of us, because she didn't have her home to return to. I didn't have the home that I was used to. My mother had died while I was in the service. I had flown. I got permission to fly from where I was training after coming back from the islands in the Pacific. And she died while I was in training there. And I came to the funeral. She was buried at Forest Lawn. But those were sad times, but there were many good times. Camille wanted to go home and visit her family, which she did while we were still at the Big Bear Lake. We had invested some money in my sister Lucille and her husband's trailer home set up there.
Trailer park.
We decided after we'd been up there a period of time to move to we were going to leave that area and move somewhere else. So we wound up buying or renting a home first in Inglewood.
And Hawthorne,
Hawthorne.
which is a suburb of Los Angeles.
It was there that one of the saddest moments for us was the fact that Kim nearly died as a baby. We were terribly worried about him. He was just a youngster, a baby in arms, and the doctor said that he needed attention. We took him to the. Is it picking up the voice okay? Or
Yeah.
you can tell?
Yeah. Just speak as loud as you can, Dad.
Why don't you tell them, honey, about that sad time of our life of having this mishap in the home that developed.
Kim was 4 months old, and Daddy was going to school, and we were extremely poor. So he would go to school, and then he had an after-school job, and then he would come home, and he would put the children in the car, and take me to a job where I was a soda jerk, is what they called it. Worked behind the counter in a drugstore, selling in the old-fashioned drugstores where they, in the movies you've seen them, where you have the little things that you push, and it, the cold drinks are served right behind the counter, and ice cream and so forth. So he would put the children in the car and take me to my part-time job, and then at 11 o'clock at night he would get the babies out of bed and come and pick me up, because I didn't ride in the city and he didn't want to leave the babies there at home alone. So during this time, Kim came down with polio. We were very poor, and we were renting a house. Rentals were very hard to find after World War II, and we were renting a large home and renting a room out in the home to a very wealthy man. And of course it was an inspiration of Father in heaven that this man came to rent just one room in the house. But anyway, we were hard times. We didn't have a washing machine or anything. I was doing all the wash by hand. But Kim got polio, and it was the saddest day of our life when they said, there's a polio epidemic, you must take him out to the general hospital. So we went out there and stood in line in the heat, a line of a number of people who were admitting their children for polio. And when we got up to sign him in, they had a pencil that they wrapped a sterilized towel around the pencil for us to sign so they wouldn't get it, because they thought it was extremely contagious. And then they had us take him in. We had Pam with us. He was just a little toddler. We had her calling right behind us, and we took him upstairs, and they made him lay. It was a large room with beds all around the walls, probably 15 children in there. We laid him in this little bed, and they had us move back. We could see him one time. They said he would be there at least 10 days if he lived, and that it was the Bulbar type polio. And they said that we could come to see him once, and we'd have to stand at least 8 feet away from the bed. Now, I'm nursing Kim. He's a baby, and we walked away from the hospital, and we just felt like, as Dad and I left that day with no family, nobody to call, nobody to help, no money, and we felt like our world had come to an end. We went home that day, and as we got home, we had a big red quarantine sign on the door that said, "No one can enter your home, and no one can leave your home. You're quarantined." A big red sign across the out front door. We went in that house that day, and we thought we hadn't gone to a church because I was not a member of the church, and Daddy would try to go to the Methodist church, and because the preachers would get up and pound the pulpit, he'd try to go, but he couldn't enjoy it, and we hadn't found out where the Mormon church was out there. I was not a member of the church, of course. In fact, the home teachers had tried to come to the door, and they'd knock, and I'd say, "My husband's not home." And they'd come while he was still at work. And we didn't have anybody in the church to turn to. A real, real low moment in our lives.
But honey, I'm sure you're coming to it. But the word got to a young bishop, just a young man in the ward, which we hadn't attended yet. But
through his friend who was a teacher at the art school. He was not allowed to go to the art school. And of course our pay was coming from his GI Bill of Rights. We just felt so helpless. We didn't know what we were going to do. We couldn't pay the rent. I couldn't go to work. He couldn't go to work. We couldn't leave the house. But he had gotten to a phone. We had no phone. You know, nobody had a phone. Mother didn't have a phone. Nobody had a phone in those days. Very few people. But he did get out to a phone. On our way home, I think we called the school to tell them he would not be able to come to school. And one of his teachers, who he had known years ago in Wiltshire Ward, got in touch with our bishop, called out there. This is good Latter-day Saints working the way they should. He found out who our bishop was, called that bishop, who was a very young man in his 20s, and told him the situation. So
we said, then of course we had a big quarantine sign on the front door that would keep people out. Would come close. We couldn't get out the back. He came to the door, knocked, and we told him, "You can't come in because we're quarantined." He says, "Don't worry about it. I'll come in."
he says, "I'm your bishop and I'm not afraid."
So we opened the door for him. He came in. Did he give the baby a blessing at that time?
He said that,
Oh, the baby wasn't there.
no, Kim was in the hospital. He said, "Tomorrow
He'd go.
I will go and administer." We said they won't even let us come. And they said they'll let me. I will go and administer to him in the hospital tomorrow. And the next day was Sunday, and he said, "And we will pray for him in the ward." And Bishop Gibby had told them our situation of Howard not being able to go to work, not getting the GI Bill of Rights, and he said, "And as far as rent is concerned, don't you worry. We will pay whatever. We'll take care of your rent. We'll send food into the house. We'll do whatever you need, and we'll keep in touch with you." Well, it turned out that we didn't need to call on him, but that is what made me start thinking about the church. I thought, I've never heard of anything like this in my life. I wasn't looking for a new church because I thought my people were the best people in the world. My uncle was the minister in town, and he was just the most perfect person. And many of my family were so good and so spiritual that I wasn't looking for a new church. But I began to think, never in my church have they ever done this kind of thing. So I really started thinking seriously. As a matter of fact, I promised the Lord that if Kim would get over this, that I would start going to church. I would go to the Mormon church because this was unusual behavior and by the saints. And we did after that. Kim was allowed to come home after 8 days. He never had any ill effects from this. There was a nurse that came into the home that taught us how to feed him and how to care for him. And I think she gave him some hot towel treatments. She came periodically for a week or so and gave him some hot towel treatments, but he never did have any ill effects. In fact, we wondered, because he was so young, they took that spinal check, in those days they would put a needle in the spine. We always wondered if he really did have polio, but We assumed that he did. Anyway, it was a very low time.
It was trying
It was
time.
very trying. No family. We had no one to call on. And we were young and, just struggling, trying so hard to just make ends meet. But it worked out all right. We pulled out of that, and of course I couldn't take care of my job anymore. I had to stay home and take care of Kim. It was a full-time job, and of course the nurse saw that we didn't pick him up and take him to work anymore. In fact, I wasn't allowed to go back to the work because he had polio. We were quarantined. But we pulled out of the quarantine, and Daddy was allowed to go to school and to go to work. And so, one of the trying times.
It was a time when I had to drive into Los Angeles, right on the outskirts of downtown, to this trade school. What do you call that?
Yes, it was
The Los Angeles Trade
Wiggins,
School. Wiggins.
Frank Wiggins Trade Technical School, but now it's
And
part of the college.
since I intended to get into commercial art, I took a course there. It was a great school for training in commercial art. And I would leave school and then go to my job billing at a gas station where they stored gasoline, and they had to bill their trucks, bill tanks to serve people and so forth. And my job was on the dock to see that was overfilled properly, and that ran late into the evening after school, and then I would have to drive a considerable distance to Inglewood, where Camille was staying, where we both
To Hawthorne.
Hawthorne, yeah. And
We were determined that Daddy would get his education. I mean, there's nothing that was too much to tolerate for him to get his schooling. We were determined. I wanted it as bad as he. In fact, I suggested it originally that we would do whatever necessary to leave Big Bear Lake and come down for him to get his education. And we were determined. And when you're determined, you can do those things. And so we made it.
the Lord was on our side. I had this commercial artist who had his art offices up in the Taft building at Hollywood and Vine Street in Hollywood. There was that big building that you've seen on the corner, 7th floor. Fortunately, he came to the school looking for an assistant. And I showed him, he asked to see some of the work of the students. He saw some of my work and decided he wanted me to work for him. So he put me on the payroll, and I worked on the 7th floor in his offices. We got along very well together, and I satisfied him with the work I was doing. So Mother and I had an income there. In the meantime, honey, we were living then at
We had rented a funny little trailer. It was just absolutely...
yes, a little trailer.
We lived in a little trailer for a while that was not as large as... Well, I can't tell you how small it was.
One room.
It was small for a two-person family.
Yes, we had 2 children then.
Of
And
course,
then
we had Kim.
finally we moved into this little apartment that was in a little court. And it was
an evening.
it was in part of Los Angeles. I don't think it was in Inglewood. It was off of Pico Boulevard there.
Yeah.
And that's where we were living when when we went into this house that we bought out on Wish Avenue shortly after Daddy went to work for this commercial artist. During the meantime, we still needed added income, and I phoned during the day up until the day that Kenny was born. I remember the day I went to the hospital, I was madly trying to phone and get selling blind maid products. I would sell these products that were made by the blind people over the phone, and Daddy would come home from work and he would drive all over Los Angeles delivering these products. He's probably spent more for gas trying to drive all over and deliver these than And it was my job to convince these people to buy these products that were made by blind people. But we made a little bit of money and enough to buy a little bit of food. But then Daddy got this job, and then we wanted to buy a house of our own. And to be able to buy the house cost $9,000. That house out there on Wish Avenue, guys, cost $9,500. We bought that beautiful home out there. 3-bedroom, 1 bath, where we lived for years and years on Wish Avenue. But Daddy didn't make enough money for us to get the loan. And so his boss fibbed a little bit on the application and said that Daddy made more than he did. We convinced him that we would have a tackle box and we would divide our money, and we told him not to worry, we'll make that payment. Even though we don't make enough to get the loan, we'll make it. So he did, and we got the loan, $9,500 for that house on Wish Avenue, if you can believe it. That was a nice house, too.
Have to have that for a down payment now.
And we got that home and moved in before the streets were even paved, before the electricity was turned on. We lived out there for a week or so, about 10 days before they turned the electricity on or the gas on it, in that pretty home that we lived in for 28 years on Wish Avenue.
That's the home where you first saw the light of day,
Yes.
you youngsters.
Mom,
Yes.
your experience of adversity, Kim related, or Dad related the experience with Kim. Is there something else that stands out? Kim was also the one that was bitten by the rabid dog.
Yes.
Yeah.
Daddy was, we were living in this funny little apartment. It was just,
Keep talking. I'm gonna have to go get another bag.
it was just, well, it was not convenient. It was, and the shades had holes and were torn, and it was a funny, strange little apartment, but we were happy to have it. But our property ended at the bottom of the steps out the back door. When you walked out there, stepped off the last step, you were in the driveway of on another home that had 3 or 4 boys that were really kind of wild, even by those standards in those days. But we were living there, and I had, we had Pam and Kim, and I was expecting Kenny. And during this time, Daddy needed to go back, to get some extra money. He needed to go back to, was it Fort Benning, Georgia, for 3 months to an Army Reserve school. And because of his getting this GI Bill of Rights and some money some way, I've forgotten all the technicalities, but he needed to go back there to that school. Well, that left me there in that funny little apartment, no fence around the yards, and Kim was super active, very active. And the minute I put him outdoors, he would just run off in some direction. And I'm expecting Kenny, and I was having some problems with coccinea, poisoning, and didn't have a doctor. We didn't have the money for me to go to a doctor to have the baby. In fact, our neighbor became so concerned that we didn't have any money. I didn't even have money for maternity clothes, and she went out and bought me some cloth, and I made a maternity blouse, the only one I had, by hand, without a machine. I made it by hand, and had made some clothes for Pam by hand, didn't have a sewing machine, out of some old skirts that Daddy's sister, Aunt Margie, had given. But anyway, because we didn't have any money for a doctor, and I wasn't worried, I just thought, well, I'll have the baby at home. You know, I've learned not to worry, just go with the punches and, you know, do what you have to do. And so I wasn't worried about it. But my neighbor, there was a Latter-day Saint in the court whose husband was an FBI agent. And there was one lovely home there, and they lived in the lovely home, and we were right across from them in the court. But she was very concerned that I didn't have a doctor, so finally she had an obstetrician friend that she talked into taking me as a charity case. And so when I was about 7 months pregnant, I went to the doctor for the first time with Kenny, and he said he would take me as a charity case. Daddy was gone to the service, and so by the time Daddy came back, I had the baby. I had Kenny about a week or a few days after Daddy got back. I had gotten to the point where I couldn't wear any shoes because my feet and legs were swollen so badly. I didn't drive, so we had to walk a long distance carrying all of our groceries with Pam and Kim, and we didn't have a walker of any kind, a stroller. So it was extremely difficult, but you know, I knew I did what I had to do. I had no washing machine, did all my wash by hand in a tub that was out on this back porch. This is long and it's boring, and there's no need to tell all of this, but anyway, Daddy got home.
It's fascinating.
The doctor took me as a charity case. He was a Latter-day Saint doctor, but
That's not Dr. Bill's.
No, his name was Dr. Clark, and he gave me so much anesthetic that I was out so badly, and they couldn't get me to wake up, that he stood me. They sat me up on the bed, and I got a very strange crick in my neck. They said they had to use a spoon to keep me from swallowing my tongue. They couldn't get me out of this anesthetic. And for weeks after I got home, I had this very bad thing in my neck. My neck was in fact, I suffered for years from a thing in my neck. Finally went to a chiropractor after. He said, now, by all means, don't go to a chiropractor. He told me why my neck was that way. He told me they had to sit me up on the bed. Of course, and my neighbor said it was because you were a charity case, you know, and it was the treatment. And he was LDS. But anyway, he delivered Kenny, and Kenny was a big, healthy, wonderful baby, just a happy. He just smiled all the time. He was fat and just a fun baby, which was wonderful because Kim had been so super active. He was a hyperactive child. He had, all the time while Daddy was gone, he swallowed ant poison on the back porch. He swallowed a Christmas bell, and he was in the emergency hospital 3 times. And my neighbor would have to run him to the emergency hospital. And one time he got out, and there was no fence around the yard, and I'm quite large with Kenny. He got out of the yard and he disappeared, and I had to call the police, and the police had to bring him home. They found him down around the block. We had no fence around the yard. Another time he was bitten by a neighbor's dog, and he had to have the rabies shot. Now Daddy was home for that. That was after Kenny was born. He was bitten by a dog, and our neighbors denied that it was their dog, so he had to have, the health department made us give him the rabies shots. He had 24. Daddy took him to the health department every morning before he went to work.
I was driving to downtown Los Angeles. It was about a 10, 12-mile drive. And I go up so many floors in this building, and it was a doctor that gave me his shots in his office. That had to be done before I went to work again. And poor Kim, they gave him the shot right here in his tummy.
The muscle.
And he didn't like it at all, but we took him down there for, I guess, probably 5 trips.
Honey, 24, he'd have 24 shots. On Saturday, they gave him a double shot for Sunday.
Anyway, it was considered dangerous enough that he had to take a full course of these shots.
I have to go back to tell you that this sweet Latter-day Saint woman who lived in this court, I've kept in touch with her. She lived, for a while, she was when David was bishop in California, Pam's husband David was bishop, she lived in their ward. And I've kept in touch with her through the years, and she is a true Latter-day Saint. True Latter-day Saint. I was not a member of the church still, but she was just really a super sweet person. Did great, the Heavenly Father has always sent somebody at a certain time to be special. Like the bishop who came, how many young bishops will come to adore? There's always been someone there, a Latter-day Saint, who has been there to help. and she was just special. She could sense that Daddy was gone and that I would be low on a certain day, and she'd bring me a piece of watermelon. You know, she'd bring it over on some lovely plate that she had, just a gorgeous plate. And she was quite a lady, just a real lady.
What was her name?
Maureen Hanson. And it was in this place, this is kind of an interesting story. One night, I had just put the children in bed and went to close Pam's door. I had bathed them and had just closed the door. You were gone. And I saw a man's face in the window in this little strange apartment. And I was absolutely, I panicked. These boys would walk by the side of our window, and our shades had holes in them. They were ripped, and, you know, I was frightened anyway. And this night, here was this older man's face in the window, you know, had his face up in the window like this as I went to close Pam's door after putting her to bed. And I just panicked. I didn't know what in the world to do. I ran and I got Daddy's, that little old .22 rifle of Daddy's. I didn't know how to shoot it. I ran and got that .22 rifle, and I didn't know what to do still, but I went on the front porch and held this gun out in front of me. Oh no, I ran across the court and I knocked on their door, and Brother Hanson, who was an FBI agent, answered the door, and he saw me standing there with this gun. I didn't know what to do with it, but I was standing on. So he started laughing and he said, "Are you a pistol-packing mama?" And I told him that this person was looking out my window, and bless his heart, he wasn't afraid. He walked all around the house that night, and they never did find out who it was. But he did tell me there was a peeping Tom in the window in the neighborhood, and he was an older man who had a daughter the same age as Pam, and Pam played with her a lot. And he said not only that, not only is he a peeping Tom, but he's a child molester. So I found out some interesting things.
Okay, without delving so much in the more challenging experiences, what is another one that you might want to pass on that had some meaning to our family? Anything in particular?
Daddy, start telling them about the thing probably that drew us closer to Father in heaven at this particular time in our life than anything else was an experience with Tim. Daddy?
Honey, you're going to have to recall these things. I'm going to have to depend on Mother because my recall is not that good anymore. And she can come right down to the most minute situation.
Women all have that capability, Dad.
Well,
that's just a feminine characteristic.
Than I can, and she remembers it better than I can, so we're going to have to pass on that. Yes, I don't pick it up.
Yeah, there's delegation and there's abdication. So you're abdicating.
I'm abdicating.
Okay.
Okay, Mom.
I'm delegating.
Just so we're clear on this, Dad's abdicating to you.
Mother does such a great job and a great memory for it.
Okay.
Well,
If you want the story, get it from her.
All right, let's go with the story then.
There are two stories, really, and I need to leave time for both. One concerns Kris, and the other one is Kim. But at this particular time in our life, again, we come back to Kim. We have always talked about all of you boys going on a mission, and just took it for granted you were all going to go on missions.
Now, what is Pam doing all this time?
Pam is just the most obedient, she almost angelic. Well, you know, are we just, I don't know if we...
Can't we get any stuff on Pam?
Isn't there any skeletons in Pam's closet?
You guys...
Can't we drag something out?
You were too young to remember when Paul spent so much time at the house, and you two would come in there with your dirty diapers, and Paul and Pam would get down and change your dirty diapers right there in the living room. She wasn't old enough to go out yet.
I remember as a child Pam's boyfriends, but anyway, Pam was gone a lot when we were really young.
She, of course, was such a delight in our lives that, you know, she made life so pleasant. But when we're talking about something that drew us really close to Father in heaven, we're talking about this time when Kim got to be old enough to go on a mission. We had sent him to BYU, really sacrificing to send him to BYU. We didn't have much money. I wasn't working at that time. And we sacrificed to get him out of the neighborhood and get him away from his friends to send him to BYU. But while he was there, he met a girl who was still in high school, and she followed him back to Los Angeles when the year was over. He did poorly that year in school, very poorly, because he and Kathy would spend so much time out at the Lake Utah Lake on the beaches. And but she followed him down there, and the bishop interviewed him to go on a mission, and he said, well, I'm not sure I'm going on a mission. I'm not going just because my father was bishop and everybody expects me to go on a mission. This is what the bishop told us. And we didn't want him to go on a mission for that reason. We wanted him to go because he wanted to go. But anyway, we had this very trying time when he and Kathy got so close, and he worked 2 jobs and bought Kathy a ring. And but Kim never discussed with us, never did he tell us that he was going to marry Kathy. But Kathy's sister came over one time and called me on the phone and said, I think that you and I should get together because Kathy and Kim have gotten so close that we better start making marriage plans. And I said, absolutely, we won't have anything to do with it. I said, Kim is not mature enough. What on earth could he do to take care of a wife? And Kathy isn't even out of high school. She's too young. We won't have anything to do with it. We said, we're waiting for Kim to go on his mission. She said, are you going to force Kim to go on his mission? And we said, no, we have no intention, but he has a patriarchal blessing that spends one whole paragraph telling what a wonderful mission he's going to fulfill. And so Kim went on, and he wouldn't discuss with us what his plans were. And finally, one time, Daddy and I, it's a long story, but Daddy and I decided we would fast and pray that it was coming to a head, that things were getting too serious between Kim and Kathy, and so we just couldn't have, we would not absolutely have nothing to do with a wedding between those two, because how could they make a living? How could they get along? Neither one was mature. So we fasted. Dad and I started fasting, and for 3 days we fasted and prayed. On the 3rd night, we went to bed about 10 o'clock, and we were weak. We were so weak. I'm not sure that you younger children even knew that Dad and I were fasting. I remember so well that night on our bed there on Wish Avenue. We went to bed about 10 o'clock and lay there in bed thinking, well, you know, what further can we do?
Remember this, Dad?
About 10:30,
Was Dad bishop at the time?
No.
Or high council?
He had been released. He was on the high council. About 10:30, Kim came into the room and sat on our bed and said, Mom and Dad, I'm going to talk to the bishop tomorrow. I'm going on a mission. And we said, Kim, what has changed your mind? And he said, you know, I don't know what came over me, but all of a sudden, I could not stand for Kathy to touch me. And he said, tonight I asked her to give me back the ring. And I'm going to talk to Bishop Swan tomorrow about going on a mission. And he did, and he went on his mission, and I don't have time to go into the beautiful experience that his mission was. You know the story.
Well, his
wonderful mission.
His mission influenced me. He came back with so many stories and pictures. I mean, it was a great experience, I think, for our whole family. You know, just the excitement. I was just a youngster, probably about not even 8 years old yet, and I just would sit enthralled and look at his slides and listen to him talk about it. And I know at that point, I told myself I was going to go on a mission. You know, I think that influenced probably the rest of our family. Kim going was the first one, and he influenced probably the rest of the family, I think. So that was an important step for our whole family, I'm sure.
But we drew very close to Father in heaven. Let me tell you, we promised Heavenly Father that if he would see that Kim went on his mission, that we would give our all. And it was just a marvelous spiritual.
Well, I wonder today how many parents are willing to fast 3 days, 3 nights continuously for their children when they start having problems. That's quite a story. I mean, it's quite a very inspirational story to hear parents doing that for their children's sake.
Several people said to us, I remember Ed Young, you probably don't remember Ed Young in the Van Nuys Third Ward, said, why don't you let him get married? They'll leave home. You don't have to worry about whether or not he can make a living for it. You just say you're married now, get out and make your living. And we said, no, Ed, no. We're going to do everything in our power to see that he does do what his patriarchal blessing says he should do, and he did. It's really beautiful.
What about Kris? Now you mentioned there's
Another thing was the story about Kris when he was on his way to school and a woman backed out and we had moved, we'd sold our home.
She ran a stop sign.
And
Did she? Or she
no,
backed out of her
she
driveway?
backed out of her driveway.
She hit me on a stop sign.
No, Kris, she was backing out of her driveway. It was, we had sold
Get the story
our home,
right.
You were knocked out, Kris. You think.
and we were renting this cute little house.
Makes for a better story, Dad.
We call it our happy home. And I would go to work in the morning. I'm now working, and I would go early, and Kris would ride his bicycle 1 mile to the north, over to the Reseda Ward to seminary. And then he would ride back and have breakfast with Daddy and Kelly. And then he would ride another mile to school, to Cleveland High School, where he had transferred because we were renting this home. And on his way to school that morning, I believe it was still dark, this sweet Catholic lady was backing out of her driveway.
Mom, it had to have been light.
And she bumped into Kris and hit him on his bicycle, and he was thrown from the bicycle and hit his head along the side of his head on the curb, and it
That's his problem today.
Still
No
effective.
It knocked him out. Well,
Knocked
sort
me
of.
senseless.
It knocked him. How can we say? At first, he got up. She said she jumped out of the car, and he was struggling to get up. He got himself up, and he started walking toward her, and she could tell that he was stumbling, and that something was wrong, and so she took him by the arm and led him into her house.
Well, I threw up all over the street
And
and all over
he
her at
began
that point.
to throw up, either outside or in her house. She said that he began to throw up, and she asked him his name, and he could not tell her his name. And so she looked in his pockets, felt around for any kind of identification, and he had no identification on him. But he did start mumbling, I am a Mormon boy. And she said she could just barely understand, I am a Mormon boy.
All I remember her is speaking a lot of Spanish. I don't ever remember her speaking English. She was
Spoke Spanish.
She was Mexican.
Well, of course you were kind of out of it, I guess, but she said that you didn't answer.
I was out of it. I can remember waking up very briefly on her sofa, and then the strong scent of Wrigley Spearmint gum, still very, very strong. And then I remember her dialing the phone, and then I was gone. And I don't remember anything from that.
Well, we got the call, and of course I rushed over there, and you were out of it, but you were able to come to enough for me to take you to the hospital.
No, honey, the ambulance took him to the
ambulance
hospital.
came and took you to the hospital.
He was hauled off in the ambulance.
Come on, Dad, don't take any high drama out of this.
No.
The ambulance with flashing lights is certainly
I
better.
carried you
Yeah.
on my shoulders to the hospital. Let's go back.
You're thinking of when you picked Kris up, he broke his arm. That's when you came and picked him up and took him to the hospital. I remember that experience in elementary school.
That happened at Stagg Street.
Yeah. But Dad did get off
I
work,
don't
came.
know where I picked him up.
Yeah, you picked him up at school and took him
And
to
you
the
were always
hospital.
picking me up. Usually it was from the principal's office.
You always go to the hospital.
Off the floor somewhere.
But this is a very interesting story, a very faith-promoting story. This woman said because she could hear him mumbling, I'm a Mormon boy, she went to the phone book and opened it up to the Mormon church. And there were so many Mormon churches, she just picked one out and dialed that number. It so happened, the one she chose, there's a whole page of Latter-day Saint chapels, The one she dialed happened to be the one where Kris had gone to seminary that morning. A man answered the phone, she said, and she told him, I have an injured boy here in my living room. I have hurt him. I don't know who he is. The man who answered the phone happened to be the teacher there that morning, and he said, well, where are you? Give me your address. She gave him her address, and he said, well, he must live in this particular ward. I will get in touch with the bishop. He got in touch with our bishop. The bishop was a school teacher. He had gone to school to teach.
Bishop Houston.
Bishop Houston. His wife was there, and she said, I know, I will call the school and find out, let them read the card and tell me where his mother is a teacher. She's at work. I will find out. I can get the phone number from the school. I will call her and she will come immediately. And so she did. She called her husband, the bishop, and told him the story, and he left to come to the hospital. The school, she called the school, and the school called Daddy's office, so he came to the hospital. They called me at work. My principal came in, and it's when I saw him walking the door and he had somebody with him, I knew something was wrong. And he said, I need to talk to you outside of the room. And he called me outside the room and said, one of your sons has been injured and he's in the hospital. I said, which son? And he says, I don't know. What difference does it make? It's one of your sons is injured and in the hospital. So I brought Mrs. somebody, I've forgotten which teacher, in to take your place. You must go immediately. And he said, I don't think you're in a condition. I went, I guess, sort of started shaking, and he said, you're in no condition to drive. I will take you to the hospital. And so he did. He drove me over to the hospital, and when I got there, Daddy and the bishop, I got there first. And here's our great big Kris. He's about 6 feet tall by then, very tall, almost 6 feet. I went in and asked them where Kris was, and when I got in the room, nobody was there, but here Kris is lying down with his eyes closed, stretched out on this, what do you call those tables? Just a table in a room all by himself. And I reached over and I could see this ridge along the side of his head, and of course at this point I still didn't know what had happened. So I was over and kissing him on the face and talking to him, trying to see if he just had this pleasant look on his face. He was just lying there with his eyes closed. And I said, finally the nurse came in the room, and I said, what has happened? And she says, we have just gone out, the firemen that have brought him in, they've gone out to try to find out exactly what happened. But they said, she started crying, and she said, your son, the fireman said, your son was saying all the way down here, I'm a Mormon boy. They could just barely hear him. He would mumble. Periodically he'd say, I'm a Mormon boy. I'm a Mormon boy. And the nurse came in and she started crying, and she says, you know, I'm LDS and I'm not active right now. But she says, this has really touched me. And she cried, and finally the fireman came in, and I asked him what had happened. It's a very interesting story. But anyway, Kris came out of this, and we sat there by his side. We got a brain specialist to come in and examine to be certain, because he was out until about 4 in the afternoon. Just lying there, they moved him into a bed. They x-rayed his head and said he had no fracture. The brain specialist said he didn't know why he was out, but he said, I think he's going to come out of it without any problem at all. So Dad and I just sat by his bed, and sure enough, about 4 in the afternoon, he started thrashing around, but we prayed. Let me tell you, we sat by his bed, and all afternoon, Dad was on one side and I was on the other, just sitting there praying that everything would be all right, and Heavenly Father answered our prayers. He came out of that without one.
Mom, talking about boys and accidents, then we'll get to Kelly's little accident with the thorn on the eye, but over the eye. Where were you, or where were Kenny and Kim when they had rented motorcycles and they ran their motorcycles through the fence? Were they living at home at the time, or had they gone away to school?
I don't recall that.
I mean, that was a tragedy. It could have been.
That was Pam, wasn't it, that ran her motorcycle through the... No, who was it?
Kim and Kenny laid their bikes down.
You mean when they had gone to Ralph's in the parking lot over there and Daddy broke his thumb?
No. This is up in the hills somewhere. They'd rented or had borrowed some motorcycles and riding around, and someone ran through a fence. They didn't see the wires. I don't know the whole story. I was just wondering.
And Kim has a gash this day around his shoulder from the bob wire when he laid the bike down and he slid into the fence. It gashed his shoulder. Where were you?
Going up in the desert, we took the motorcycle up there, and Kenny rode it up there, and I don't know whether that was the time that accident occurred.
Well, that was the first of many for Kenny. Many accidents.
You know him, he was the motorcycle boy. He wanted to ride him all the time.
But you know, considering that Kenny rode that little thing, and what was that little thing he made? He put together, what they call that little
Mini bike.
Mini bike of some kind that he put together, you know, from scratch. But considering he had very few accidents, I have an idea that accident that you're talking about, Kris, happened away from home, because I would remember if Kim had a serious place like that on his shoulder. I remember it just vaguely, but I don't think he was home, and I don't think I realized how serious that accident was. They were at school or someplace else when that happened.
Well, you had 4 boys, and they were always getting themselves cut or beat up or something happening to them.
Did we cover the story of getting bed in that court we were in by?
Yeah, we got that.
The hospital.
Yeah, we talked about Kim and you taking him up to the hospital.
Tell you what, before we change directions, Kelly's got another question. I think before we call it quits for tonight's taping anyway. I'm getting a low light here signal, so we need to move in maybe to the living room.
Kris, I wanted to say just before we leave that we asked you and questioned you at length about why you would say, I'm a Mormon boy. You couldn't tell anyone your name. No one knew your name. You couldn't tell the firemen. They kept asking you, but you'd mumble, I'm a Mormon boy. And you said that you had had a feeling as though you needed a priesthood blessing. That's what you told us was the reason that you were saying, I'm a Mormon boy. You felt the need for priesthood blessing.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move into the house. All right. Dan, let's take a little stroll down memory lane, and if you could just talk about your fondest recollections as a child. Again, not so much times and dates. We have that in your church, or we have that in your history. But more memories and recollections, especially those most enjoyable for you as a child. What stands out?
Are you ready? Well, I think the recollections I have were something that made my early childhood very livable and enjoyable. I was born in Salt Lake City. My mother had married my father, who was prospector. He and his brother were prospectors, and they spent their time out of Utah going west out there some distance. They had a mine, and they devoted themselves to it. Unfortunately, they were both drinkers. And Mother took care of me. I didn't see much of my father. But Mother also felt it would be good for me to live up at grandmother's. My grandmother lived in northern Utah with all her boys, who were my uncles. And they were all farmers up there in what we call East Garland. Running right through that area was a lovely wide canal from which all the farmers in that whole area up there would draw water. In addition to that, one of the things that really helped and bring back fond memories was just east of the old farmhouse which my grandmother lived in and my uncles were born and raised in, was close to the cliffs that led down, we call it the caves, that led down to the Bear River, and ran just probably a couple of blocks distant away to the edge of the cliffs. I had paths that I would find to go down to the river, and I spent a lot of time down there. Our cattle was turned out to graze there. There were a number of cattle that they always kept there in the barn, and then would take it out in the morning and spend the day grazing in the Bear River area. I would go gather them at night. They knew to come to a gate, which I would open and bring them on. Back home, they knew it was time to return to the barn. And those were days I'll never forget. Grandmother was the sweetest person you'd ever want to know. Just a wonderful human being. But she had these big, grown, strong young men who ran the farm and planted their seeds, their seeds in season for the grains and the alfalfa, and I had a part of that. They would make me work. I used to drive the dairy horse when I was hardly able to straddle it. It was a fat horse, and my legs would probably stick out parallel on either side of the horse. But my job was to help them when they got the hay. They'd cut the hay, bring it into the dairy. It was on a hay wagon. They would put a big fork into it, and then they had this tow horse that would pull the cable. And I was on it to move the horse. Old Bud, he was a fat thing. And I'd get him to pull the cable, and they would lift go up to a large pulley, and they swing this pole around. You've seen those hay poles, and build up their stack. And I felt pretty important with that job, because I was just a youngster. My grandmother took awfully good care of me. Mother had to work, and she was unable to do her work and care for me, so I was under grandmother's care. We later left there and we moved into the Salt Lake area. And I remember growing up there in the house in which we lived, where it was a big house just on the east side of downtown, probably just about 3 or 4 blocks out of the downtown area, but it seemed further out at that time. A big old-fashioned home. And we stayed there, and my stepfather was working. I was quite young. And one of the things I used to enjoy living there was I would crawl out a window onto a roof covering another room downstairs in the home. We were quarantined there for smallpox as well. We spent time there, and I spent my time out on that roof doing, making things out of matchsticks and toothpicks, and sticking them in the roof, and building up what I thought were various types of figures that I could do with toothpicks. Anyway, it was a time when I would go down the street in Salt Lake City toward nightfall, and when it got dark and I was down there, I would get scared to death and start for home. Run all the way. I don't know what caused me to be so scared at that time, but it was memories they were memories that I don't forget. Mother was an angel. She was just the best mother you could ever have, and it was just unfortunate that she married my stepfathers, which, of course, my real father had this brother, and they worked together, I could tell you, in the mines out east of Salt Lake. And he used to come in, he liked to visit, and I realized that he was my father, but I never had a real love for him, because he just wasn't, a father to have around that you could, learned to love and respect. But he cared a lot for me, and he had a sister, Aunt Nell, who moved down into Los Angeles, and he lived in that Jewish section over on the east side. Am I coming in loud enough, do you suppose?
Oh, you're fine.
My Aunt Nell, have you ever heard me speak of Aunt Nell?
I don't recall.
No, but I recall driving some Sunday afternoons, or yeah, down to the Jewish
It was over in the
section,
Jewish area, yeah.
and we'd buy kosher pickles and bagels. Do you remember those?
I don't.
Excursions into the Jewish part. I remember just storefronts with meat hanging down, and you know, it's the interesting odors. I can vaguely remember the smells as we would drive down those dark streets there in the Jewish section. But
My Aunt Nell, I think, was a Jew. She was so happy in that area. She never did.
Well, was your father a Jew then?
No, none of them have Jewish blood in my family line. I told you he and his brother were both prospectors practically all their lives. They were looking for that rich mine that they were going to discover.
Well, Dan, I don't want to interrupt this, but just so I can clarify it in my mind, who was it who taught you the gospel? Was it your mother? Because it wasn't your father. Your natural father didn't introduce you to the gospel.
your
No,
grandmother.
I was introduced when I was staying with grandmother and my uncles.
In Garland?
They were in East Garland.
In
yes.
East Garland.
Up close to the bluff and Bear River and the canals that run through there. And
Your father didn't want to have anything to do with the church,
No.
or any church.
That's right. He wasn't.
Nor did your mother.
Church-minded. Well, now mother was introduced to the church, but she was
She'd been baptized.
having married as she did. It just took her away from the church. And Ross Smith, when she married him finally, who was Margie's father, he would never even think or consider becoming a member of any church. He was in the devil's hand. I tell you, he was anti-church-minded or gospel-minded in every way.
It might be interesting to bring up here that research has shown that Daddy's father, real father, belonged to the same ward that his mother belonged to in Plain City, Utah. And we don't know the story, but that is probably where they met. Daddy thought for years that he was not a member of the church, but records have shown that they both were members of the Plain City, Utah ward.
Yeah, can you remember that?
Well, Dad,
That doesn't come
briefly,
back, but I know it's true.
Briefly then, what is maybe a good experience you remember, like at Christmas time? Do you have any particular instance as a child,
Oh,
a tradition that your family did, or something that you recall that was exciting?
beginning with that thought, I'll return to when Grandma and my uncles were taking care of me. Have I ever pointed out the little farmhouse? Have you ever had a chance to be in that area when I pointed it out?
Up in East Garland?
Uh-huh.
Oh
We
yeah, the
visited the
canal
place.
and
We had this big stove in the kitchen. It's just a small kitchen, but my uncles and I would gather there in the cold evenings. They would slice potatoes and cook them on top of this wood stove, and those were special treats. They were good days to remember. But Mother married Ross D. Smith at the time. We were living there too, and I went to live with them. And he opened a garage in Garland, which was just a little town they always drove into to see a show or to buy some more things they needed at home. They had this little theater, and we used to occasionally go to that. And my stepdad opened up a garage repair, and he worked there for some time. I lived with Mother and my stepfather at that time. But finally, they decided that was the place that he really could do as well. He better move into Salt Lake City, and that was the time we moved down there, and I lived with him. Those days, I touched summarily with some of the instances of living there. My brother and sister, Lucille and David, were my brother and sister by my father, and blood relations. Sis used to work in a, let's see, we moved to, that comes up later when we moved to Los Angeles, and that goes into a long story about my sister working in a cafe in Los Angeles on the southern outskirts. And I lived in a basement room there in South Los Angeles, just out of town. My brother David was taking care of me at that time. That's the place we lived together. Just an abysmal room to be in, just cement walls and a cold basement, dark basement. But it was, had a bed and we could stay there. But my sis worked in worked in a restaurant several blocks from where we were living in this basement. And I would go up there and stand outside the window and look in, and she saw me there. She would beckon me to come on in. And she would have something prepared for me that she'd slip to me, and I would take her back to the basement room and eat. And they were hard times. There were so many changes and moves that I could spend the night telling you about moving here, moving there, and how we adapted to what those areas I moved into, how they affected my life in many ways.
No, it was.
And it would take time to tell you.
It was at this point, Dad, that I remember you telling me about boys chasing you down the street. For whatever reason, you said you really didn't fit in with some of the boys. The weeping hands, you used to wrap claws around. Wasn't this the time that you had the problem with the sweating hands?
Yes.
That was in high school, wasn't it? When
That
you were,
was in high school.
when you were attended.
But it was down in this area.
Was that in California?
Oh yeah, I had hand
Changed
problems.
schools.
But just to quickly move, my stepfather got work in San Francisco. Mother went with him, and she took me along, and the three of us, and the baby, Cora Margaret, were in San Francisco. And how old would I be? I was just still a youngster, so to speak. But I was old enough to catch streetcars and ride the bumpers to where they were going. We used a lot of streetcars in San Francisco. And the place I spent most of my time was, I'd get up and I would either hop in a car, or if I had any money, pay for a ride out to the big park they had. It's a grand park in San Francisco out on the bay side. And all the animals and all those things, I just loved them, and I would spend my day there. And then I'd try to
By yourself?
have a streetcar or find a way
You were
home.
by yourself?
Uh-huh.
Or was David with you?
No, I was alone. Margie, as a baby, was there, and I was the only other child in the family at that time. But
Where was David?
David died. He got to the age of he had come to Los Angeles. Was down there.
So he was quite a bit older
But he
than you.
married young too. He married this girl. Can't think of her name right now. But he married her, and they came to Los Angeles. And David was a sickly baby, and he grew up sick. He had real health problems, and he died while he was in his early 20s. And what was his wife?
Okay, so anyway, you're in San Francisco.
We're in San Francisco. We weren't up there too long before we returned to Los Angeles.
Her name, by the way, was Florida or something like that.
Florida was the name, Cal, yeah.
And he died in his early 20s.
Yes.
And he was quite a bit older than you.
Yes, he was.
And,
He was
and
my older
when
brother.
your mother married your stepdad, Ross Smith, he and Lucille left home. didn't they? They were old enough and they left home.
They wouldn't take him at all. He was an abuser. He was a child abuser.
Ross Smith was?
He was.
Your stepfather?
My stepfather. He finally, they had moved into a home over in West Los Angeles, right off Pico Boulevard. We rented it. We never got into buying a home. They were always rented. And I told you he was a child molester. He got himself in a real pickle. He was working, he was providing at the time. He was a machinist, first-rate machinist. And he had molested a little girl in the shack that they had built back in the back of the kids had built back in the backyard where we were living at that time. And the word got out. And he knew that if he was there, when that word was out, the parents and the police and everybody else got it. He up and flew the coop. And so Mother was on her own, so to speak. I can't recall just where he finally wound up.
But from that time on, you never did see him again.
There was no love lost there.
Oh, yes. He came back.
Wait a minute.
I knew Ross Smith. He died after we were married.
But he never did come back to
Oh, yes.
his mother.
Oh, yes.
That's right, he did. But he was gone for some time, though. I mean, when he took off, because he was afraid to come back.
Now,
I
Ross,
might
Ross
add-
Smith was cruel to Dad, was he not?
No,
Not really,
he
not
got
really.
along with Dad.
I was
Well-
the only child that really got along with him.
You took the name Smith,
Yeah,
Yes.
I
even
took-
though it wasn't a legal transfer of
That's
name. You
right.
did take the name
I-
Smith, which
it was-
allowed you
it
to
was
get
in
along.
my best interest in mothers and all that I take his
Whereas
name.
David and Lucille would not do
So
that.
I went through school, graduated from Los Angeles High School, Howard K. Smith,
And do the service.
and into the service as Captain as Howard Smith.
By the way,
I'll
I
get my manuals out. I was the art director. You've seen them, those blue
At high school.
high school manuals.
You were the art director for
I was the art
yearbooks and all of those.
And one of the reasons that Daddy had a hard time and why the students would chase him, he changed schools how many times?
Oh, goodness.
Something like 22 or 32 times.
I went to
You
so
know.
many grade schools, and always the new
Just
guy
kept
was, you know,
picked on,
you were
and
picked on if you came in.
One time Daddy had a pair of white trousers and he wore them to school to tell that story and how the kids, and nobody was to wear white trousers.
But the
except
seniors.
They were going to
seniors.
catch me and take them off. I outran
You ran all the way.
The whole body of your pals running after you. Take your pants off, you can really run.
Well, they talk about, psychologists talk about the fight and flight response. You chose the latter, which was probably smart.
Well,
What were you, a sophomore in high school or something?
I was a sophomore. Well, I went through high school, of course, and graduated.
Had a lot
from-
of friends
from,
in high
from
school.
Los Angeles High School, one of the good high schools in Los Angeles that I graduated.
When did
Now, it was at this time, Dad, that, if I remember the story, you had to wrap your hand in gauze, or why?
I had a weeping
Was it during the high school years that this was
ailment.
happening?
It was
Eczema.
when I was in high school, when I got out and was trying to get work and other things. I'd have this weeping in my hand to just get moist. And, I went to the doctor, tried everything. And, I just couldn't get rid of it. I was, imagine how you feel. You have to live with that.
And your feet?
And I had it to an extent, my feet as well. Don't know just how I got it or why, but it was a disaster in my early.
Did you have a lot of girlfriends through school?
Tell the
Not a
story
lot,
about your
not a
girlfriend.
lot, but I got in with a group. The fact that I was the art editor and
Somewhat talented, they were.
somewhat talented, they kind of brought me into the group. Lovely girls and great guys, and most of them were wealthy, and we'd have parties out in their homes in the wealthiest part of town. I thought I was riding a star in the sky there, through those days. Graduated with honors at the school. I was one of the better high schools in the west side of town.
Tell about the night you took the girl on the date and you borrowed your brother's car. This is funny.
Yeah, David was it was his old Ford. He hadn't passed on yet. He had bought this old Model T single cab Ford.
Was that David's or was that your other brother, half brother?
That was David's.
Okay. I was thinking it was Warren was staying with you or there, and it was Warren's car, but whatever.
Yeah, David hadn't passed on that when I was in school. Anyway, I had this date, and I'd gotten in with some kids that they lived in the best part of town, big, beautiful homes, and they took me in, and it was just, when they put on a party, it was a party. And I was invited, and I was supposed to bring a girl, and I got this girl to go with me, but I didn't have a way, so I got my brother's permission, Warren, to take his old Model T cab, if you remember them, way back, and took my girl to this, she was a nice girl, nice family, dressed beautifully. Took her to this party way out in the rich area of West Los Angeles. And that darn car would go about a block and then conked out on me. And the radio got so hot I'd have to stop and get some water someplace to refeed it.
And it was spewing
It was
water.
just spewing these clouds of steam back over the car. And here's this girl, dressed up for a party, and she was gracious enough to put up with that. But I liked her. But after that event, I just couldn't ever plan on going out with her anymore.
Oh,
And that thing would start to steam and pop off out of the radiator, and I'd have to pull over and get some water someplace and refill it. And that's the way I got home. But one of my fond
Well, now didn't you own a car at one time and you'd have to...
Oh yeah, the car.
You lived on a
my
hill.
Stepfather, we had this old Model T that the roof had finally been blown off or torn off, and he was using that until they got a big Hudson that he bought secondhand. So he, rather than just give the car away, it wasn't worth anything to speak of in those times, that kind of a car, he let me have it. And that was the highlight of my life when I had this old Model T. It was a touring car, it wasn't a cab, with no top. I got it while I was still in high school. I used to drive it to LA High School. And I had a lot of good friends, real good friends, lived in rich areas. And that's where I went to that party, wealthy people in a wealthy area. It's great. That ride home I'll never forget.
But to start your car, your mother would have...
Oh yes, yeah. While the car was still working for me, I would go into the backyard. We had a big backyard and some sheds in the back, but there was a runway from the side of the house around the back, and I would go around and I would back into the back porch of this old Model T. And I'd jack it up because I couldn't get it started unless it was jacked up. And so I would get in the car and get it started. And Mother would come out and push me off the jack.
You couldn't get it started.
And she'd pick up the jack.
She pushed you so you could get it started.
That's right. Well, wait a minute. I would crank it. I could get it started cranking it. And when I got it cranked, Mother would push me off the jack because it would crank easy with the wheel jacked up. And so the yard was big, and I was backed up to the porch. And we lived in a flat, 4 families, two. We were in the lower right. And she pushed me off the jack. She'd pick up the jack, run after me, and throw it in the back seat. And I'd make this swirl, the U-turn out in the backyard and down the side of the house and on my way. And as long as I keep that car running, I was putting along.
I didn't have to come to a stop sign.
But those were days I always remember.
So those were in the 20s, right? You were a flapper.
Well, it was the 30s. I
30s.
graduated class 31.
Okay.
And,
So you lived those days in the roaring 20s
well, the Roaring 20s was a part of
in Los Angeles.
my life, all right.
When Daddy was in the service, his parents lived in Hollywood. His address was Hollywood, and he took quite a kidding in the service about living in Hollywood. You know, in those days, Hollywood was the big thing, and his parents lived in that was his home address, Hollywood.
Well, it'd be fun to spend time talking to Dad about his military. Maybe we'll have to do that sometime, but we're running short on film here. Oh, I think we've got, looks like an hour and 35 minutes we've already run off.
We gave you the
Hour
most
35.
important part of the military is when I met your mom here.
That's right.
Well, I would like to get more of that, but Mom, while we can, why don't we go ahead and just turn the attention to you, and then we'll probably end on this note and ask you the same question that we asked Dad, and that was just your recollections and early childhood recollections and the fondest memories of your father, your stepfather.
And your mother, family members?
Considering the problems that were in the marriage with Mother and Dad, I have really fond, happy memories of my childhood. I can remember the first memory that I have is, and I just got a picture of this house when I was back in Selma just recently, was the big house that we lived in that was next to where they built the elementary school, right next door. It was the largest house in town.
Now, are you in Alabama or Mississippi?
I'm in Mississippi. I was born in Scoober, Mississippi. And Scoober in those days was it was about the size of St. George, you know, some years back. It was the home of the East Mississippi Junior College. But the main reason Scoober was in existence in those days and why it's just a stop on the road anymore, it was, in those days, it was a great railroad stop. It was the biggest railroad town in that section of the country. And so that's what it was noted for. But I was born there, and my father was managing a large pecan orchard, and part of that was to live in this great big lovely home that was in Scoober. And those are my first memories of being out there in that pecan orchard and running through the leaves and helping pick up nuts and down behind the house, the outhouse of the toilet was down the hill back of the house, and Mother always had a great big turkey gobbler that she was raising for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and how we would go down to go to the toilet, and this big old turkey gobbler would spread his tail feathers out and strut along the ground and run after us. And he was mean, so we were scared to death of him, but that was an interesting memory. We were one of the few houses in town that had a pump on the back porch. We didn't have running water, but you could pump your water right there on the back porch and take it into the house. But I remember leaving there and moving to another house, and after that, Daddy really struggled with farming. He tried to be a farmer, but he really wasn't bred a farmer. He didn't really know how to farm, and he had a lot of problems. So the next house we moved into, he tried to farm cotton, raising cotton, and it didn't work out very well. But this is the house where the Presbyterian minister came to our home. Daddy was a Methodist and Mother was a Presbyterian, and her family were ministers. My uncle, my grandfather, my great uncle, my grandfather's brother was the Presbyterian minister in town, and I thought he was just the most wonderful man that ever lived. I wasn't looking for any extra church because I thought we had the true religion. I was very happy with my religion. One thing I remember dearly, I had the sweetest grandfather. When we lived at this white house that I was talking about that was next to the school and Daddy was managing the pecan orchard, our grandfather would come in his Model T Ford every day And he would drive in that driveway, and us kids, Norm and I, would just start running to meet him, because he would bring us bananas and candy every morning. My sweet grandpa Kimbrough, George Kimbrough, would come and bring us this candy. And he and Grandma lived about 4 or 5 blocks from us at that time. But I never remember Grandmother coming to our house. We always went to Grandma Kimbrough's house for Christmas dinner and Thanksgiving dinner, and we'd go down there. They had a radio, and we didn't have a radio, and so we would go to her house for special occasions. But anyway, we moved from that house to the Devane house, and Daddy struggled, and I remember the hard times we had. And it was here that I was a great tree climber, and I climbed every tree around the house. I was quite a tomboy. Daddy wanted me to be a boy when I was born, and I wasn't, because they had had Norma, my older sister, and he was disappointed that I wasn't a boy. So I don't know if that influenced me or not, but I was quite a tomboy, and I climbed all the trees. But anyway, when we moved to the Devane house, Norm and I walked home from school, and before I even went in the house, I started climbing a tree right up out in front of the front door. And the first limb that I reached, I grabbed on to kind of swing on it, and it broke, and it was a dead limb, and I fell on my back, and it knocked the breath out of me, and we had a little scare there. But I remember one time living in that house, and the Presbyterian minister, Mother had joined, Daddy insisted that Mother join the Methodist Church. Even though all of her family were Presbyterians, her uncle was the minister, Daddy thought he wanted her to join the Methodist Church. The gospel was so similar that Mother did. But the Presbyterian minister, another minister who was an associate, was visiting Mother out at the Devane house, and I can remember I had climbed the tree so I could listen to what they were saying, because children in the South, the children were to be seen but not heard, and you kind of stayed in the distance, you didn't come around. So I climbed this tree, and Mother was entertaining the minister and his wife out in front of the house, and so I climbed the tree so I could be listening to what they were saying. I was probably about Annie's age, or a little younger, maybe Janessa's age, old enough to know better, and girls didn't ever wear trousers in those days. It was terrible for a girl to wear trousers of any kind. So I'm sitting up there with just my little panties, little girl's panties on, in this dress, and Mother looked up, and the minister looked up, and there I sit over their head, probably with my legs spread out. And I could tell by the way Mother gave me this look that I was in for trouble. So I scrambled down from the tree, and sure enough, when the minister left, I got the thrashing, the paddling of my life for sitting up there in that tree over the minister's head. But anyway, I didn't, in my innocence, I didn't see anything wrong with it. I was just there because I wanted to hear what they were saying and what was going on. But anyway, we moved from there, and Mother, of course, was given the plantation, the deed to the plantation that her great-grandfather had built down in Old Scooper, which was 4 miles out of Scooper. It was where the Old Scooper was, where the town used to be. But when the railroad came into town, and by the way, I've forgotten what great president came to...
Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis came in and...
Who was a Confederate president.
Came and dedicated the railroad as it came in. But when the railroad came into Scooper, the town moved into there to the where the railroad stopped. So Old Scooper then was no longer the town. It had a store out there. But anyway, we moved out to the Old Scooper section, and Mother, I think there were 270 acres of land and this old colonial home. And so we moved out there, and those are the real fond memories of my life, just running around the fields. It was the time that was very traumatic in the life of Mother and Daddy, because Daddy was struggling to make a living, and he was working, what's his name, Roosevelt?
Theodore. Teddy.
Not Teddy, Delano.
FDR.
FDR. FDR was now president, and this was the Depression, the deep Depression years. And so he started the Workmen's, WPA, Workmen's something, I've forgotten what WPA stood for, but my dad worked on a road project for the WPA and he was trying to farm on the side, but he did this to make money. And finally, his car, he had gotten a new car every year, which he couldn't afford. And finally, they had taken and repossessed his car, so Daddy walked 4 miles every morning to work. He walked into Scoober every day, 4 miles. And because of that, he started drinking, and he and Mother had a lot of problems. But to me, they were happy years because we lived out there in the area where we were so free, and we could run in the fields. We had a little stream running through the pastures, and we had persimmons.
Keep going.
Ask who.
Open and see who it
Ask
is.
who that.
See who it is, guys. You're both here, so open and see.
Just the wind blowing the door.
Let's see if somebody's trying the
No,
door.
it was just the wind blowing the door.
Well, is that door latched again?
It is now.
The screen door?
Does the door normally do that when the wind
No,
blows?
yeah.
Oh, I've never heard that before, but that's interesting. We could draw the curtains, draw the drapes.
Yeah, that's right.
The light.
Anyway, you were saying now about
There were persimmon trees, and we had persimmons, and we had all kinds of fruits and vegetables, and we were poor, but we weren't poor. Mother raised everything in the garden. You know, we had all kinds of vegetables, and we had cows that we milked, and Norm and I had to milk the cows. There was a time when Norm and I were required to get up and milk 7 cows before we went to school. We were Krista's age, and Norma was 2 years older than I. And we milked 7
so
cows
about 10 and 12.
and separated the milk in a hand-turned separator before we went to school in the morning, and pulled the big milk can, slid it 1/4 of a mile down to the road to be picked up by the milk truck. And so we worked hard, but it was wonderful. Those were happy years in a lot of ways. And we lived in that house. Mother got that plantation with the knowledge that my great uncle John, who had never married and had been born and raised on that plantation, would continue to live in the home. So Mother took care of Uncle John, and he was such a sweet man, just a sweet elderly man. He was in his 80s in those days, so we spent our years, you know, talking. And Uncle John, he talked to himself. He would sit by one of the big trees and he would talk to himself, and he'd just laugh and laugh to himself, and we'd stand around behind the tree to see what he was saying, and we'd sneak around and we'd say, "Who are you talking to?" And he'd say, "I'm talking to myself." And we'd say, "Well, why are you talking to yourself?" And he'd say, "Because there's no one else who has brains enough for me to talk to."
Well, now what about your aunt, your mother's sister? She was quite an influence in your life too.
Yeah. Would you like to speak with them? Tina, go ahead, Mom.
Aunt Louise, my mother's sister, was a free spirit, and she had left Scoober. She had married because she had to. She had married a man, and they had separated, and they had a son, and she left her son with Grandma Kimbrough to raise, and she went to Louisville, Kentucky. She was a very brilliant woman, very pretty, and she worked for Western Union, had a very important job with Western Union, and she worked for them for 35 years. But she would come back to Scoober, having lived in the city. She would come back to Scoober, and she didn't pay any attention to what all those things that women were not supposed to do. She was the first woman to ever come to Scoober and smoke. She picked up smoking in Louisville, and she'd come back and sit on Grandma's back porch, and it was Grandma's back porch was real high and had a lot of steps that came down, and the neighbors that lived around could see Aunt Louise sitting on the back porch smoking. And she would also wear pants, and this was a no-no for women in those days, and she would even wear shorts. And she would sit on the back porch smoking and wearing shorts.
Real hussy, huh?
And Aunt Louise didn't care what people said. She was just, you know, she did her own thing. and had a very important job that women, were not supposed to have had in those days. She was one of the big wheels with Western Union in that part of the country, and did a lot of traveling with Western Union. But Aunt Louise would come and bring us cloth for Mother to make us pretty dresses, and she always brought us something when she came back to town. Even though Aunt Louise was not one of my favorites, she was my sister Norma's favorite, and they got along very well. But I was made of a different stock. I didn't like smoking, and Norma took up smoking right away when she was 17 years old. And she and Aunt Louise lived together in Louisville in the same apartment and got along very well. But anyway, those were good years. We rode the bus 4 miles into town to school every day. And
what about a Christmas or some kind of family tradition that you remember that was real exciting for your Thanksgiving, whatever?
We always went to Grandmother Kimbrough's house for Thanksgiving, and we always had cakes. We didn't have pies. I never remember having a pie. I'm sure I ate some, but I never remember having a pie, but Grandmother made the most beautiful cakes. And all the family gathered at Grandma Kimbrough's house in Scoober, and Grandpa Kimbrough's house. They had a very lovely home. Aunt Louise supported Grandma, and she always had paid for a black cook, a Negro woman who took care of the house and cooked meals for Grandma. However, Grandma was a wonderful cook. And she always had a lovely home and had the radio and electricity. When we lived in the country, we did not have electricity. We had lamps, and one of my jobs was to clean the chimneys on the lamps, and I hated that job. You got your hands so sooty. But we read. I went all through school reading by one of those lamps. We didn't have any electricity. We didn't have any indoor plumbing. We didn't have indoor water. We had a well out back, and we had a bucket on a rope on a pulley, and you'd drop the bucket down in the water and pull it up, and we had a gourd, a dipper on the side of the well that was made out of a gourd, and we would dip into the bucket and drink and hang. We had a little string, and then we'd hang the dipper back there by the side of the well, and all of our water was brought in from that well. And we had a Saturday night bath. Everybody bathed every Saturday night. And we would bring a big zinc tub and put it into the kitchen. We had a very large zinc tub. We would bring the water from the well and put it in there and heat it on the stove, and we all bathed in the same water. And we had the big argument about who was going to bathe last in the tub, because the water would get so soapy and so dirty by the time we had all bathed. We had the big argument. That was our Saturday night bath. And but Christmas, you asked me. We had some interesting traditions in the South. Until I married Daddy, and until I went to Louisville, I didn't know that I thought everybody got firecrackers and Roman candles for Christmas. That was just, we celebrated the birth of the Savior with firecrackers. We got them in our stocking. And we would always get one big long Roman candle that we would always shoot off the first thing before daylight on Christmas morning. And we would get firecrackers, never on the 4th of July. That was a time for picnics and family get-togethers. It wasn't a time for fireworks. And we didn't have much money. We would get grapes with seeds in them in our stocking. We didn't especially like them, but that was a tradition. Mother always saw that we got grapes with seeds in them in our stocking for Christmas. And we got an orange. That was the only time during the year we ever had an orange, was we got one in our stocking. And we were really lucky if we got one toy, one doll or something. I can remember one Christmas. It was traumatic for me because Mother was waiting for Daddy to come home, and they were going to go into Scoober to buy the toys for us for Christmas. And it was not a big thing, but we got one toy each. And Daddy had spent all of his money. He got drunk and didn't come home. And by about dark, just before dark, Mother started out, and she walked all the way 4 miles into Scoober and borrowed some money from Grandma Kimbrough, and bought us each a little toy of some kind. And I've forgotten who brought her home in a wagon. It was late at night, and she Norma stayed up and waited for Mother to get home. And the Christmas tree was never decorated until Christmas Eve. That night, the tree was decorated, and we got up the next morning, and the tree was part of Christmas. Was to get up and how excited we'd be to see, the only thing they had on the tree were those little old long tinfoil icicles, and Mother would pop popcorn and, string popcorn around and things like that. It wasn't decorated anything like what we have today. But,
Well, now, both you and Dad have grown up in some interesting times. You've seen a lot of changes. Do you remember your first airplane that you ever saw, or your first automobile? I mean, we take things like that for granted today. They're all over.
It was exciting when I was on the farm as a kid to see a plane fly over. None of these great big monsters, but just any plane that had a prop on it. We'd run out and call everybody out to see the plane that was flying over. They were a novelty, so to speak, in my early childhood.
Didn't you say once, Mom, your first time you saw a car, you were just a little girl and it scared you to death?
that was my grandmother. No, Daddy, we always had a car. Daddy and my grandfather always had a Model T, and that was, that was what was really popular in those days. And then the Roadster with the rumble seat came in, and Daddy would get a new car when he was managing the pecan orchard. He would get a new car every year, and we children would ride in that rumble seat. And that was just so fun. You had a little rubberized thing to put your foot on to get up there and climb into the rumble seat. And but my grandmother remembers the very first car that she saw, and they were scared to death. They thought it was some kind of an animal, and they went and hid on the side of the road behind some trees, and when it had gone by, they went out and smelled the dirt to see, they were frightened, but we always had cars. But Dad and I remember when the first radio was very, very exciting. It had a lot of static, and we'd put our ear to the phone to hear. We would get so excited with all this static, and we would hear a little bit of music. You remember that? What did they call them? The crystal radio or something?
Mm-hmm.
And
Crystal.
it was difficult but we would get really excited when we could hear any kind of noise at all. And of course, Grandmother had electric lights, and it was just this big old bulb that hung from the middle of the room. A cord would hang down, and we just had a light bulb with no shade of any kind on it. We just thought that was marvelous. That, that light, Grandmother, we'd tell everybody, oh, Grandmother had electric lights. And Grandmother had a faucet where it wasn't in the house, but it was outside. They had a faucet with running water outside, and you brought it in the house in buckets. And we thought that was just marvelous, and Grandmother had running water.
What about indoor plumbing?
Oh, nobody had indoor
Swill
plumbing.
buckets in the
It
house?
was the toilet out, outside, and you'd bring the jar, the slop jar, we called it, inside at night.
That's just the same picture that I had back in the farm when I was talking about Grandma and my uncles. We bathed in the kitchen, in the tub, and had a water bucket outside of the porch, always with a dipper in it to get a drink. And it was brought in from outside all the time.
Well, in our home at 7457, my earliest recollection, we might as well have had outdoor plumbing because the bathroom was always locked. I could never use it when I needed to.
Kim was,
Yeah, it was Kim.
was in there with
There was
that
always
bright
this
light on.
strong iridescent glow coming from underneath the door. The door was hot to the touch. Or Pam had it locked.
Yeah.
Oh, tape is over. Tape end. We're blinking here. We've gone through one tape, so I think that's a good note to end on. Just anything in summary. You've got about 60 seconds. Anything that you'd like to say as we end this particular segment? What we'll do is get another videotape, and we'll go more into Dad's military, how you guys met, where you met, and a little more about each of the individuals in the family.
Maybe some of our experiences camping and so on.
Okay.
We're at the end of the row here, so you're out of tape. Let's call it quits, and we'll pick it up again later.
Super.